For now, welcome to a new episode of System Update, starting right now. In the United States, over the past several decades, we have watched the collapse of all sorts of industries as the American Midwest has been deindustrialized, as all kinds of industries like factories and coal have been gutted. And usually it's a very sad thing to watch. People lament it because large numbers of people lose their job, people lose their livelihood, communities get shattered as a result of all of that. It's been one of the principal reasons why so many Americans are disillusioned with and angry toward the political class. One of the first times I really believed Donald Trump was going to win the 2016 election was when Hillary Clinton went to West Virginia and gave a speech and said, look, it's time for you to get over it. Accept it. Coal is gone. There are going to be new jobs. You can learn how to do other things. There's no more coal. And then Donald Trump went to West Virginia 3 weeks later, mocked Hillary for scorning coal workers and said, I'm going to do everything I can to save the coal industry. And I watched an interview with a West Virginia coal miner who said, when asked, look, I'm not really sure that Trump is going to be able to, but the fact that he understands the difficulties that this poses for our community and is at least aware of it and not scornful of it and trying to say we're going to do something to help you is something infinitely better and more inspiring than what Hillary came and told us to say. One of the very few exceptions to the negative emotions that people generally have when they watch industries fail is watching the collapse of the liberal corporate media. It has been going on now for many years. In fact, prior to Donald Trump, the model of how corporate media was going to sustain itself in the digital age was something that almost nobody could figure out. It was really an inherently unsustainable model. And it was really the arrival of Donald Trump that gave that industry a sugar high. He saved so many jobs in media, especially the people who most hated him. Every anti-Trump network, every anti-Trump website saw a skyrocketing of business solely from people who couldn't get enough content about Donald Trump, especially negative content about Donald Trump. Liberals became monomaniacally obsessed about politics, but all sugar highs eventually cause a crash. And as people got tired of hearing about that every day, and especially once Trump went away, all of that got exposed, and then the collapse really started accelerating. And so while you have a couple of giants in the media industry that are really consolidating almost everything, eating it all up, like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, that have really become successful models, pretty much the entire rest of the media is collapsing all around it. And the reason is because they don't provide anything of value. They don't provide anything that people want. If you want liberal opinion, which is all that they ever offer, you can just go to the New York Times and get it. You don't need any of these other media outlets for it. They just offer nothing but the same repetition. It's extremely predictable. It's extremely banal. There's no ideological heterodoxy permitted. There's no vibrancy within them. And on top of that, they have been caught lying over and over and over again about so many of the most crucial issues. Our country was dominated for 3 years by a deranged conspiracy theory that most media outlets got on board with. And when you add up all of these failures and all of these kind of gutting of the passion and vibrancy of the industry, of course people started turning away. They still want to know about politics. They still want to be informed. They just stopped trusting these media corporations that they understood had been lying to them, and they began looking elsewhere, which is what explains not the collapse of media, as people like to say, just the collapse of one sector of media, a big sector, to be sure, but one sector, which is the liberal corporate media. And yet independent journalism continues to thrive in ways that are hard to explain. Now, for whatever reason, over the past 2 months, 3 months, and even over the past several weeks, this trend has really accelerated to the point where so many of the most recognizable and longest standing media brands are just starting to collapse in complete free fall. And even the billionaires who decided that they were going to invest in media outlets sort of as a charity project. We saw that with Jeff Bezos in the Washington Post. We saw it with Steve Jobs' widow who bought The Atlantic. We saw it with Pierre Midyar and many media outlets like The Intercept, where I used to work, but now the Bulwark and Bill Kristol's various projects are all starting to abandon media as well, because billionaires don't actually like to lose money year after year after year. And that's what's happening. Because when you have a public that has contempt for the product that's being produced and contempt for the people who are producing it, and they no longer trust it and value it, there's no way to get enough of their attention to be able to monetize it. Here from the New York Times just this last week, or actually this week, you see the headline there: billionaires wanted to save the news industry. They're losing a fortune. Quote, Time Magazine, The Washington Post, and The Los Angeles Times, owned by Mark Bainoff, Jeff Bezos, and Dr. Patrick Soon-Shiong, are still losing money. Time, The Washington Post, and The Los Angeles Times all lost millions of dollars last year, people with knowledge of the company's finances have said, after considerable investments from their owners and intensive efforts to drum up new revenue streams. In the middle of last year, the Times was on track to lose $30 million to $40 million in 2023, according to 3 people with knowledge of the projections. Last year, the company cut about 74 jobs, and executives have met in recent days to discuss the possibility of deep job cuts, according to 2 other people familiar with conversations. Mr. Bezos hasn't fared much better at the Washington Post. Like many news organizations, the Post has struggled to hold on to the momentum that it had gained in the wake of the 2020 election. Sagging subscriptions and advertising revenue led to losses of about $100 million last year. At the end of the year, the company eliminated 240 of its 2,500 jobs through buyouts, including some of its well-regarded journalists, well-regarded from the New York Times perspective. But that's 10% of the Washington Post's newsroom being laid off, despite having the backing of one of the 2 or 3 richest people on the planet. The Atlantic, which Laurene Powell Jobs bought in 2017, has set a target of reaching 1 million combined digital and print subscribers and achieving profitability. The company said it had more than 925,000 subscribers as of last summer, though it was still not yet profitable. The difficulties facing the companies are getting only more severe. Here from yesterday, NPR tells an even grimmer story. The title is "A Look at the Wave of Layoffs Hitting the News Industry." The LA Times has confirmed, and its employees are letting us know online, that it has laid off about 115 journalists in its newsroom of what had been only about 500. That represents about 22-23% layoff happening in a single day. The Washington Post just laid off 10% of its ownership. Like the LA Times, it is owned by a civic-minded billionaire. We at NPR went through a 10% cut last year. Here from the USA Today from 2 weeks ago, January 12th, the headline, NBC News lays off dozens in latest bad news for U.S. workforce. See 2024 job cuts so far. USA Today confirmed the NBC News layoffs on Friday. Other companies starting off their new year by slashing their workforces included Google, Twitch, Amazon, and Discord. The layoffs at NBC, first reported by Puck News, are the latest in an onslaught of cuts made in the journalism industry throughout 2023, including by NBC News, which slashed 75 jobs the same time last year, according to a timeline provided by Forbes. Now, I can spend all night, literally, reading to you articles like this from these exact media outlets that are in the part of the industry that is failing. And you will find everything in there about how deep these cuts are, how unprecedented they are, about how so much more is coming because the scenario is only getting worse and worse and worse. You'll see attacks on their competitors, like an independent media who they claim is responsible for spreading disinformation and doesn't provide the kind of responsible journalism that these outlets provide. You'll see all kinds of emotional, heart-tugging posts about how sad it is that these people are losing their jobs. These same people who went around telling other people in dying industries, oh, well, too bad there are no coal jobs, go learn how to code. And yet they treat the collapse of their own industry as one of the world's greatest tragedies. You'll find everything in these articles blaming Donald Trump and the Trump movement for undermining faith in American journalism. The one thing you will never, ever find, and believe me, I have been talking about this for a long time, so I look far and wide for any effort to find it is any kind of self-reflection, any kind of effort on the part of the journalists who are in these failing sectors to ask of themselves, why is it that the kind of journalism I'm producing has no market? Why is it that the public hates me and my colleagues? I began my journalism career not by working at a major media corporation, but by just simply starting a blog one day in 2005, and I was able very quickly to build a large audience because what I was writing about and the way I was writing about it, obviously there was a market for it. There were people who were craving it and they couldn't find it elsewhere. That's how you succeed in journalism. When I was at The Intercept and it was funded by the billionaire P.O. Midyar, and people thought, well, we don't have to care about things that are beneath us, like trying to get people interested in our writing, trying to develop an audience. I used to always give a speech to them that I knew fell on deaf ears, which is that there's no such thing as good journalism that people don't listen to or care about. Journalism is not poetry, which can be ignored for 2 centuries until it's discovered under a bed, and then poetry experts say, wow, this is real art. Poetry and art can be beautiful and of the highest quality, independent of the impact that they have. That is not true for journalism. Journalism is not an art. It is solely a function of how it can affect society for the better, of how it can expose secrets, make people aware of things that they ought to know about, that the powerful are doing. But if you don't have a way to attract people to be interested in what you're saying, no matter how beautiful your article is, no matter how well constructed and well written, how nice the graphics are, if nobody's reading it, by definition, it's not good journalism. And that is the problem, one of the problems with the corporate media that is largely liberal, which is overwhelmingly the vast bulk of what they are, especially in the age of Trump. They all decided that their mission, their overarching mission, was not to inform the public, but was to defeat Donald Trump and his movement. And so they all became homogenized. They all became activists. They all became overtly partisan. And they all became copycats of one another. There's barely any dissent. Who is a kind of maverick within corporate journalism? The minute there is one, they're gone. Even at Fox News, Tucker Carlson started gradually and then rapidly deviating from standard conservative politics, and despite having the best ratings, he was out. The one thing corporate media does not tolerate is any sort of heterodoxy, any sort of challenge or divergence of views. No real debate possible. You can have debates between Republican and Democratic strategists about horse races. Oh, Nikki Haley's going to win. No, she's not. But not about the real issues governing how power is dispersed in the United States. And then on top of that, you have all those media frauds, major media frauds, in which the country has been drowning for years, that come not from 4chan or Facebook or social media, but from the largest media corporations in the world. And you just look at polling data, and we will show it to you in just a second, that shows that people just hate journalists. They hate corporate journalists. They do not trust them, and therefore have no interest in what they're saying. Now, there are other macroeconomic factors that are playing a role in the collapse of these media companies, to be sure. The monopoly of Google and Facebook and ad revenue, the difficulty in monetizing content in the digital age, the fact that people don't have subscriptions that come to their house anymore, that people have expected to be able to read content for free. These are all cultural changes that have affected media outlets. As these media outlets weakened, they got taken over by venture capitalists who just wanted to suck the profit out of them and didn't care at all about the bones that they left these institutions in. But none of that would be happening if these institutions maintained the trust of their readers and had a lot of people interested in what they have to say. Because if you look at new media, if you look at independent media, people who have the ability to attract interest in their work and who develop trust and faith in their viewers are doing better than ever. The media is not failing. The media that is composed of corporate media corporations, liberal media corporations, Brooklyn-based digital liberal outlets, they are the ones that are failing. And therefore, it's not that hard to understand why. It's because their behavior has caused, deservedly so, the public to lose not just trust in what they say, but interest in everything they're doing. Now, one of the people who has decided that she is a success story, who regards herself as one of the giants of American journalism, is Taylor Lorenz, who used to work at the New York Times, caused one drama after the next, then made her way to the Washington Post. She basically, as we're going to show you, started her career by hanging outside of houses that are filled with 16 and 17 and 18-year-old TikTok influencers, where she would try and induce them to speak to her and give her secrets. She would go and get 17-year-olds canceled. And so she built a TikTok platform just by using the names over and over of 17-year-old boys who were extremely popular among adolescent girls, even though she was 40 when doing it. And somehow this convinced her that she's some kind of like giant of American journalism who now is in a position to issue State of the Media addresses, similar to the way the president issues a State of the Union address. And so she went to TikTok to talk about the reason why her entire generation basically has proven to be complete failures. And I think it's really worth listening to what she has to say. Obviously not because there's any wisdom in it, but because it illustrates the pathologies and sicknesses that have caused the collapse of that part of the media and the unbelievable inability to accept responsibility. Even though she purports to say some of this is our fault, you'll see in the way in which she says it, it's really just the pretense of accepting responsibility, but not actually any attempt to grapple with the true pathologies of media.
The entire journalism industry is basically in a free fall. Today, the Los Angeles Times laid off 115 employees. They wiped out their entire DC bureau in an election year. They laid off pretty much all of their sports teams. They killed their entire tech and business section. They laid off breaking news writers, social media editors. The list goes on. But what's really dark is this is just the latest in months and months and months of layoffs in the media industry. In fact, tens of thousands of journalists have been laid off in the past year. Major media companies like BuzzFeed News have completely shuttered their news operations. Time magazine also just laid off a ton of people, and Sports Illustrated basically shut down last week. Pretty much the entire digital media ecosystem that myself and a lot of other millennial journalists came up in has been completely hollowed out. And it's not just digital media.
I gotta just let her repeat that sentence because I love it so much. It's like kind of sweet dessert just entering my body and animating every one of my cells. Listen to this sentence.
Millennial journalists came up in has been, and a lot of other millennial journalists came up in. Entire digital media ecosystem that myself and a lot of other millennial journalists came up in has been completely hollowed out. And it's not
the area of media that myself and a lot of my fellow digital millennial journalists has come up in have been completely hollowed out. That is exactly what has happened. And there are very good and valid reasons for it. And while as I said, I don't take pleasure in watching people lose their jobs and be sad about it, I absolutely take pleasure in the hollowing out of industries that are very toxic and damaging to our society and to our republic, which includes this one.
Just digital media sites. Local news has been obliterated. The newspaper industry is cratering. Radio is essentially dead aside from NPR, which has been gutted. Meanwhile, hundreds of workers at Condé Nast, the parent company of pretty much every major magazine from GQ to Vogue to The New Yorker to Vanity Fair, are on strike because they're also facing impending layoffs. Even mainstream national media outlets owned by billionaires like The Washington Post, where I work, and The Atlantic, where I used to work, have done layoffs. If you're a young journalist today, there's almost no on-ramp to traditional journalism. Even if you do get a job, journalists' salaries have been stagnant and even declined. And by the way, we don't make that much to begin with. I don't think people understand how bad the world would be without journalists.
Oh, people understand that the world would be bad without journalists. In fact, that's exactly the problem we have, is that none of these people are actually journalists. They do not perform the journalistic function. The journalistic function, and if you go and look at what people for hundreds of years have been describing as the core purpose of the press, the reason there's a freedom of the press guaranteeing the First Amendment is because we need a mechanism to confront and undermine and subvert and check institutions of authority and the most powerful people in our country. That's what journalism is for. It's to bring them down pegs. It's to expose their secrets. And what instead has happened is that these people who work in these corporations have done the opposite of that. They're the ones who are causing our country to be without journalists, even though they bear the HR title of journalists, because they have done the opposite of what that function is. They serve power. They disseminate its propaganda. They do not challenge or investigate these institutions of authority. The people they investigate and challenge are ordinary citizens in the country. Taylor Lorenz's biggest story as a journalist was uncovering the private citizen who ran the Libs of TikTok account. Taylor Lorenz has never challenged or exposed any lies or secrets or corruption in the CIA or in the FBI or in Wall Street or in Silicon Valley. I think her second biggest story is that one time she was in the app Clubhouse and she heard somebody use the word retarded, and she ran to Twitter and told like a tattletale, and she attributed it to Mark Andreessen, and it turned out Mark Andreessen had not said that, so she had to correct her second biggest story. Taylor Lorenz has more corrections appended to her stories than almost any person working in media, and the amazing thing about that is her stories are so trivial that it's almost impossible to even get an editor to care enough to correct them, and yet she has a mountain of them. Long ones, big ones, major ones. And yet she seems to think she's the success story, and on some level, bizarrely, she kind of is, given that she's at least been able to draw attention to herself just because she's just such an extreme, she's almost like high camp at this point. I have to say that I've kind of come to appreciate Taylor Lorenz in the way that just these kind of people can have this sort of campy, iconic appeal. But there's nothing positive about her journalistically, except for the fact that she provides a window into the pathology that is causing it to collapse. So she is right that society is worse off without journalists. And the problem is that the more people employed by these big media corporations, the less journalists we have. And that's why I say it is not just well-deserved, but a cause for celebration to watch these outlets that have done far more misleading and far more propagandizing and far more attacking of ordinary citizens than powerful break down and collapse and disintegrate because they're anti-journalism and not journalism. And because of their failures, people are paying increasing attention to independent media, people who have offered something that the public is interested in to develop a level of trust and faith that you can find people who will inform you, who will do their best to tell you what they see is happening. You may not always agree with them, but you know that they are at least doing their best and have no constraints, no corporate constraints on the sorts of things they can and can't say. Do you know how many times during Russiagate, when it was dominating the news, when I was out there constantly expressing skepticism and doubt and pointing out all the evidentiary flaws in the primary Russiagate narrative that every day, almost every major corporate outlet in this country was ratifying and endorsing? I got emails or DMs from people who work inside these media outlets, who are people who are kind of mid-career, writing to me and saying, thank you so much for doing what you're doing. I wish I could do it, but I feel like I can't. Because in corporate media, in liberal corporate media, the minute someone steps out of line or sticks their head up in any way to challenge liberal orthodoxy, they get mauled by liberal Twitter. They become the first on the list for when layoffs happen and the last to be hired. Because no editor, no news outlet wants to be screamed at by liberals on Twitter for having hired a heretic. And every journalist who works in these major corporations knows that the only way to advance is to stay in line, to be conformist, to serve orthodoxies and never to question it. And nothing is more corrosive of the journalistic spirit and ethos than that. And that is why these sectors are collapsing. Now we're about to have a guest on whose response to Taylor's video was fantastic, and I don't want to take too much away of what I'm going to ask her about and what she's going to say, but I do think it's important to note that Taylor Lorenz's State of the Media address, in which she's claiming that traditional media is dying, is true. The question is, why does traditional media deserve not to die, and who is it that killed it? Those are the questions that she would never ask. Now, I don't want to go too much into Taylor Lorenz. I don't want this to be focused on her. I do find it hard somewhat times to resist discussing her, because it's just such a extreme case of somebody who kind of illustrates all the diseases plaguing journalism. She's just undisguised about what she is. So she does kind of serve as almost like a textbook for understanding what's been happening in corporate journalism. But the fact that she's considered the success story is so ironic. This is how she began her career. This is how she built the platform. Here's from the outlet Digiday in March of 2020. Here's the headline: how the New York Times' Taylor Lorenz gets teenagers to talk about their digital habits. And it's all about how she would lurk outside these popular TikTok houses filled with 17 and 18-year-old boys. And people assume she must be like in her early 20s, because who else would do that? And it turned out she was like well into middle age. She's very sketchy about what her age is, I think in large part because of this. But getting 17-year-olds to talk to her and exposing their secrets, and then finding cancelable tweets that they posted when they were 14, is the way she built her platform. And it illustrates what corporate journalism has become, turning their guns and all the resources that these outlets provide, not on the powerful people in society, but on the ordinary people in society, typically the ordinary people who challenge the powerful. That is what has corroded and corrupted journalism more than anything, other than their willingness to spread lies and propaganda in order to advance their partisan agenda that primarily centers around the monomaniacal effort to defeat Donald Trump. Now, just before we get to our guests, I just want to show you a couple of data points that illustrate just how little esteem Americans hold these kinds of media corporations in. Here from Gallup, October 19th, 2023, so just a couple of months ago, you see the headline: media confidence in the U.S. matches the 2016 record low. Quote, the 32% of Americans who say they trust the mass media a great deal or a fair amount to report the news in a full, fair, and accurate way ties Gallup's lowest historical reading, previously recorded in 2016. Another 29% of U.S. adults have, quote, not very much trust, while a record high 39% register, quote, none at all. And we've recently showed you polls that basically the only people who have faith and trust in almost every major media corporation, other than Fox News and Newsmax, are Democrats. So you have an entire industry catering to one political party that represents about 30 to 35% of the public, that is constantly having to feed them and validate their views, because the minute they alienate them, the dwindling audience that they have will dwindle even further, so they're captive to their audience in a way that really can't be overstated. I once talked to a host at MSNBC who told me that they don't get episode by episode ratings, they get segment by segment ratings. And they told me, and this is 2014 or 15, that whenever they would put on a guest that was critical of the Democratic Party, you could watch the audience just click away and go somewhere else. They didn't want to hear it. And that conditions those people and trains them that if they want to keep their job, they have to refrain from alienating their audience. And that means never criticizing the Democratic Party. And so they become more and more homogenized, more and more banal, more and more predictable, more and more willing to lie, and therefore less and less trustworthy and less interesting to huge numbers of people who don't identify as Democrats. That is the state of corporate media in the United States. The problem is that for those people, their part of the media is the media. The reality, though, is that there is a big part of the media that is thriving. It's the part that has not fallen prey to those defects. So when I watched that video from the Washington Post's Taylor Lorenz, the one I just showed you, in which she kind of postured as the dean of digital era American journalism, sermonizing about what went wrong and what she referred to as her sector of the media. I was so transfixed by the utter absurdity of that person that I really could not muster a rational analysis of anything she said. Taylor, by the way, now identifies as a disabled person because she claims she suffers from long COVID and various immunosuppressive disorders, which is more or less exactly what one would expect from her. So perhaps the deep compassion that I feel for her predicament also prevented me from being able to dissect this address that she delivers to the public about the state of the media. But fortunately, someone put into words exactly what my sentiments about all of this are. She is the media analyst and political commentator Hannah Cox, who, among other things, is a fellow of one of my favorite DC activist groups, the White Coast Waste Project, which has done a remarkable job in building a very bipartisan coalition to oppose federal spending on gruesome and completely unnecessary medical experiments on animals. And in a single tweet, Hannah not only identifies the glaring and hilarious flaws in Lorenz's pretentious speech, but way more importantly, she identifies these broader developments governing the collapse of traditional corporate media and the rise of independent media. So as soon as I saw that tweet, I reached out to her and asked her to come on to discuss her analysis, and was very delighted when I learned that she had the time to do so tonight. And we are very delighted to welcome her to her debut appearance on System Update. Hannah, thank you so much for taking the time. I'm excited to talk to you about all of this.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm a huge fan of your work, so it's wonderful to be here.
That's nice of you to say. Thanks. So before we get into these broader themes, and like I said, I don't want to make this focus on Taylor Lorenz, in part because it's not particularly significant, even though it is extremely entertaining to talk about her. I just want to get your what was your visceral reaction upon listening to that video?
Well, I, like you, just love to hate on Taylor Lorenz. I think that's the only reason she has a career, is because she just makes people so angry they can't look away. It's a total train wreck. And, I run an independent media company called BASEDPolitics. We are a nonprofit, but we are in this sector where we are focusing on new media, on podcasts, on YouTube, on Instagram and TikTok. And I found it exceedingly condescending, first and foremost, her assertion that journalism is dying. Journalism is alive and well. People appreciate actual journalism and they're willing to pay for it. What's dying is the mainstream legacy media that has failed to innovate, and that also, like you said, has become more of an arm for the state and more of a propaganda machine than actual journalistic outlets. So I guess they don't assign Who Moved My Cheese to read in journalism schools these days, but I think people like Taylor need to pick up the book, because the amount of entitlement that came across in this video really just slaps you across the face. She's saying that these outlets are owned by billionaires, and yet they're laying all these people off, as if because these people are billionaires, they should have to keep losing money for crappy work that people don't want to pay for. At the end of the day, her work and that of many of her colleagues is not creating value for people. People don't trust it. I saw a recent poll that actually said 50% of Americans believe that the mainstream media intentionally lies and misleads them. And so she doesn't connect this fact that in order to have a job in doing something, you have to create value in that job. And she's no longer doing it, but she expects to still have a cushy job and thinks all of her other colleagues should as well. Meanwhile, the people I think who've worked in the sector for some time, who have energy, who are entrepreneurial, who have the sort of innovative genes, they've left these companies because they are very restraining, because you cannot speak truth to power within them, because they often are so partisan that people really can't talk about things that matter or ever sort of cut through all of the noise out there. And so those types of people have already left, and they're doing just fine on places like Substack and YouTube. She tries to undermine people in this kind of capacity and say that they're not as trustworthy, they can't be fact checked, or their videos are too short. What people want is shorter video, and sometimes long form video as well. But on top of that, this assertion that these people are less credible than her is hilarious, because the mainstream media gets it wrong all the time. From COVID, they were not the ones that broke the story, by the way, on who was actually funding that Wuhan lab. It was the White Coat Waste Project, who you mentioned earlier, who I'm a fellow for, who happened to be doing the work of journalists because they were filing Freedom of Information Acts, trying to figure out if gain of function was happening, because it is animal torture. And so they had sort of the smoking gun. They couldn't even get the mainstream media to publish that information for well over a year. And it wasn't until Rand Paul took that information and countered Dr. Fauci with it that all of a sudden you saw the mainstream media start to change their tune and say, oh, maybe we were funding this lab. Maybe this thing could have been lab created. I think the amount of trust that people have lost in these institutions is valid. They are not in any way more credible. Their fact checks are often laughably incorrect. I recently had to run a fact check on the fact checkers at USA Today a few weeks ago because they were claiming that there isn't a kill switch that they put in place for all vehicles beginning in 2026. Representative Thomas Massey was trying to get that overturned, and they were calling him crazy, saying that this hadn't been passed and using really ridiculous language to sort of dance around the fact that that was exactly what was in the legislation. So from really big things like COVID and its origins to war to basic pieces of legislation and what's in them and how it's going to impact the American people, they aren't doing their job. They are not credible. There's no way that you can hang their hat on what they're doing. And so people are right to turn to independent media. And lastly, I'll say, just before I pause, I also thought there was a lot of a victim mentality in Taylor's video, which you often see from Taylor. She really likes to play the victim. And I just think that it is such a slap in the face to journalists who are actually putting their lives on the line. There have been over 80 journalists killed in Gaza in the past couple of months as they are trying to report on war crimes that are happening there. You yourself have put yourself on the line and endangered your safety, both in the US and in Brazil at times. Julian Assange is still sitting in prison for his reporting. I mean, there are so many journalists who are doing incredible work and who really are sacrificing everything to bring people information and to try to push back on the powers that be. And so for her to try to play victim was just really disrespectful, I thought, to the actual craft of journalism.
Yeah, that time that she went on MSNBC and started weeping about how essentially she's so endangered because people criticize her on the internet when she has never in her life challenged a single person of any power. I've watched people like Julian Assange rot in prison. I've seen journalists killed in war zones. I've been, several governments have attempted to prosecute me and illegally spy on me, and all kinds of journalists who, as you say, put themselves in danger all the time. And these millennial journalists who basically have turned themselves into arms of the powerful really believe that because they're occasionally criticized by people on Twitter who then are censored, that they are actually somehow really victimized. And it was amazing. One time, or a couple times now, Taylor Lorenz has been allowed to write articles and columns that refer to me. And, I know I'm polarizing to a lot of people, but my journalism and my career speaks for itself. And she was permitted to repeatedly refer to me as if it were my title as a right-wing influencer, as though I'm like some sort of TikTok dancer, while, she continues to call herself a reporter. And the reason is because ideologically the Washington Post sees me as an enemy, and therefore anything goes. And I think that's so much of what people have come to realize about this kind of new crop of journalists is they have thrown all caution to the wind. The other thing I just want to pick up on what you said, obviously it's always going to be the case that media outlets are going to make mistakes. This has been the case forever. Human beings make mistakes. Human institutions are fallible. The solution, though, when you make a mistake is that you own up to it as quickly as possible. You account for how that error happened. You apologize for it. You correct it. You retract it. The lies that we're talking about that this sector of the media has told that is now failing are not trivial stories or incidental details they got wrong. They were the ones who, for the first several months of the pandemic, pronounced that it was proven that the COVID pandemic did not emanate from a lab in Wuhan, and that anyone who said otherwise was engaged in false conspiracy theories to the point that they got censored from the internet. The thing that drives me the craziest to this day is that prior to the 2020 campaign, they ratified the CIA lie. It came from the bowels of the CIA that the reporting on Hunter Biden and his activities in Ukraine and in China in connection with the Biden family was Russian disinformation. Everyone now knows that was a fabrication. Not one media outlet that spread those lies has ever felt the need to come and say, here's why we got this wrong. We apologize for having done so. Here's what went wrong. Here's what we're going to do in the future. Why do you think it is that people like us can kind of look at these lies that they have told on so many critical stories? They drowned the country in Russiagate for 2 or 3 years, only for that investigation to end debunking the core conspiracy theories. So many examples that you can give. And I really think they don't see that they don't see that they have been more responsible for the dissemination of disinformation than almost any other source of information in the United States. Why is it that you think they're so incapable of understanding the validity of these critiques?
Oh, I don't think it's that they misunderstand. I think that they are arrogant. I think that they have every assurance in their minds that the government's going to come in and save them and shroud them from competition. They're working all the time for this right now, right? And Taylor Lorenz is notorious for going after tech and saying the government needs to regulate tech companies more. And you'll often hear them going after things like Section 230. There was the Journalism Competition and Preservation Act. They're introducing all these bills saying we're trying to protect journalism. We want to make sure that journalists can still compete in a modern world. But really what they're trying to do in these pieces of legislation, when you dig into them, is eliminate independent competition. They are really trying to ensure that independent media outlets, independent journalists cannot compete with them. They're trying to find ways where they can get together and collectively bargain with social media companies so that only their articles and links can appear, essentially. I mean, it's really, really corrupt. But I think because they do work so hand in hand with the state, and you're correct, they absolutely worked with the state to censor people on social media during COVID. But, oftentimes when they're getting their facts or they're bringing you their sources, it's just people in government that they're talking to. It's not like they're going on the ground and really like getting in the nitty gritty and doing serious reporting. They're just calling their buddies in the intelligence community and then just trotting out whatever line they're given from these guys. But because they have had that cozy relationship for so long, I think they have every assurance that they believe the government's going to come in and save them and squash their competition. And they really I don't think they have totally wrapped their minds around just how far out of the gate this is. And that's because they have been so slow to innovate. Most of the people who are running these newspapers or who are writing for them, they're not the innovators. The people who are, they're already out here doing the kinds of work that you and I are doing. So they don't quite understand just how far gone it is. TikTok is now the top search engine for, I think, 40% of Americans and growing every day. People increasingly do not trust institutions whatsoever. They're seeking out individuals that they like, that they have, good relationships with, that they identify with online. That's who they want to get their information from. They have a healthy distrust of the media, and they've seen how corrupt the media is as well, not just in their horrible reporting style, but in the tactics that they use. Taylor herself has outright doxed people. So, she's gone so far as to actually publish people's home addresses and work addresses, and then has the audacity to go and cry about online bullying and harassment that she faces. They lie about people. They ruin their reputations. They try to get people fired. People are not going to forget this kind of thing. I think when it comes to the pace of the media and how often they're wrong in their reporting, that can slip by people because Americans are busy and there's just so much news coming at them every day. But these deeper sentiments about the way they behave, I don't think are going to be forgotten. But I do think people need to be on guard against these kinds of legislation that they're trying to pass in order to try to squash competition.
It's interesting. You have this, kind of this other side of the story that Taylor and people like her cannot comprehend. And if you look at all these stories about how the media is failing, they talk about the only sector of the media that they are in, that they know, that's the only sector of the media that they recognize, even though under their noses, millions and millions of people literally are turning to other alternatives and to get their information from people who they've never even heard of and have no idea exist, even though they command much bigger audiences than those people. And you wrote in one of your tweets, in one of your paragraphs in response to this video, quote, you said journalism is not in free fall, contrary to what Taylor Lorenz claims. The dinosaur legacy media is, and that's precisely because it no longer offers journalism, but is really just a state propaganda machine. Now, I recently had Tucker Carlson on my show, and we both talked about the fact that when we were in our last jobs in media, mine with The Intercept, his with Fox News, we both believed when we were there, genuinely, that we were free to say whatever we wanted. We were free to report on what we wanted. We had no real constraints. And it was only once I quit and he got fired and we decided to embark on our own, did we realize how many kind of subliminal limitations there were on the kinds of things we could actually say or were willing to say because of how much difficulty it would create with our colleagues or with our employers if we were actually to say it. It was the most liberating thing in the world for me to leave The Intercept and become completely independent, for him to leave Fox, and you see the change in him as well. I don't know if that's something that you can compare, but because of how independent you are, do you feel this kind of passion and liberation for the work that you do that I really think is missing in all of these people who labor at these media corporations. There's no joy in what they do. There's no vibrancy. There's no freedom. And you can just see the passion drained out of their soul. Do you feel that as somebody who's in independent media and feels excited about what you're able to do?
Yeah, I never worked for corporate media, but I did sort of work in the nonprofit sector for much larger institutions, all of which were sort of in the libertarian vein, which is mostly where I place myself. But even within those institutions, I definitely felt that kind of parameter around me, trying to keep donors happy, trying to ensure that your boss was happy with what you said, not speaking out on certain issues. I think that even as an independent media person now, you do still have some of those obstacles because of how the algorithm is, right? You want to retain followers, you want people to click, you want people to watch, and it is a bit difficult. Even though I'm a libertarian, when I'm critical of, say, Trump on something, I'll often lose 100 followers immediately because I have people following me who like him. And so there is audience capture, and I think anybody working in this industry has to be very cognitive of that and really work to push back on it. That's one reason I formed my company, BASEDPolitics, as a nonprofit, because I wanted to actually shield myself from those market incentives, right? We want to be successful, we want visibility, but we want to make sure we are always able to speak out when it's necessary, to speak out when it's scary. Right now, it's a little scary on the right to speak out against Israel and just really push back on some of the foreign policy around that. I think that if you are just dependent on clicks, or you're just dependent on people sort of within your echo chamber to support you, the likelihood that you do that really does diminish. So we do take that into account with my company, and we do work to push back on that. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of people in media, they really don't think through those things. And that's why you end up seeing the media consistently on both sides becoming a little bit more and more to the fringes, right? Because they're just playing to their echo chambers, when really most of America is not on the extreme left or right. They're in this middle ground here, and they're, I think, hungry for something that's more nuanced. They're interested in other ideas, other ways of looking at things. I think it's pretty much inarguable at this point that the two-party system is failing the majority of Americans in this country. And so there is interest out there, but in order to reach those people, you do have to overcome the algorithm barriers that want people to stay online. And so they want to feed them, what they think they'll like over and over and over. And then you also have to overcome that sort of audience capture. I love this J.K. Rowling tweet that she made in her books, Harry Potter, where she said, it's really easy to stand up to your enemy, but it's a lot harder to stand up to your friends. And I think anybody working in independent media, political media especially, has to have the spine to do that.
No, I'm so glad that you're saying that. There's audience capture for sure in independent media, but there's also a ton of audience capture in corporate media because, as I said, everything is so polarized now. The New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, MSNBC, NBC News, ABC News, they talk primarily to liberals, primarily to Democrats, and they know that any material that cuts against the grain will lose them audience, and so they don't do it. There's a lot of people in independent media who I see who are relying on this kind of polarization model where they just feed people every day the kind of ideological preconceptions that they want to be validated. And I've often talked about how there were the times in my career when I had to say things or report things or analyze things in a way that I knew were going to alienate a significant portion of my audience. As difficult as it is to do if you're focused on short-term metrics and you know it's going to result in a lower audience or people being angry at you who support you for a couple of weeks or even a longer than that, at the end of the day, what you're doing is building a long-term audience that is coming to you not because they want you to mimic or recite the things that they're saying. They want you to be honest with them because that's the thing they hate most about corporate media is they perceive this lack of honesty. And I'm glad to hear you say what you're saying because I think a lot of people have a hard time with that. But over the long term, you will build an audience. And we've seen this in the last 4 months with how many viewers and subscribers we lost over our coverage of Israel. And yet on the net, you end up building your audience and you replace people who only want agreement with people who want to be challenged, who want to have thought-provoking content, even if it is difficult for them to hear things because they don't agree with them. And I really think that one of the key points you made is that, look, some parts of media are dying, but it's being replaced by independent media. And I do worry that independent media, if it becomes this kind of polarized silo system where everybody's just feeding a partisan or ideological crowd every single day, will start to replicate the worst pathologies of corporate media. But there's so much in independent media of people who feel free enough to be able to kind of be honest with their audience that I think an alternative is being constructed. And in the long run, that's the thing that gives me the greatest hope.
That's exactly right, Glenn. You build the audience that you want, and I think you've built an incredible free-thinking audience. That's our goal as well, and we've seen that too. There's a lot of smart, thoughtful people out there. I often have people in my audience say, I come from the left, I don't agree with you on everything, but I like listening to you, and that's my kind of people, because I'm in that bucket too. I constantly want to be exposed to new ways of thinking and other ways of looking at things, and we need to find those people and instill more of that in our society, where people are intellectually curious and they're hungry for more information, and they have some humility about the way they look at the world. So I know they're out there, and I think this is an incredible time in the age of information. It really is amazing to see the gains that we've already made. Were it not for independent media, we would not know the truth about things like Hunter Biden's situation. We would not know the truth about what happened with COVID. There's so many things that Americans are now having far greater access to that, they were gatekeepers for so long that were prohibiting us from really trying to figure out what was going on beneath the surface. So we're at the cusp of something really great. I think this is something that is empowering for average Americans. It really is something that gives them the tools they need to fight back and take more active role in their society. So I'm excited about it as a whole. I do think we have to keep in mind, those pitfalls that we could fall into. But on net, we've got over 160 million people making content these days. Of course, not all of them are necessarily political, but of those, about 50% now are full-time. So independent media is thriving, it's growing, and anybody who's willing to compete, who's willing to come in and innovate, I think is going to thrive. And those who don't, they need to learn how to code. They deserve to not have jobs in journalism anymore.
Absolutely. I mean, it's interesting that the most successful person in independent media over the last decade is probably the person who is most difficult to pin down in terms of partisan or ideological allegiance, and that's Joe Rogan. And I think he kind of proved that the vast majority of people are not served by a model that adheres to one ideological or political line. That's not what they want. That's not what they trust. And I think ultimately that is the success for independent media, and it gives me a lot of hope, not just seeing the part of the media that deserves to die, but the part of the media that deserves to thrive. And I think your response to Taylor's video captured that so well. I'm really appreciative you came on and took time to talk to me about it. I'm going to have you on once to talk about the White Coat Project, which is a group that I love so much and that entire cause. But thanks so much, Anna. It was great to talk to you, and I hope to do so again.
Absolutely. Good to see you, Glenn.
Have a good evening.